Hi, this is Dave here, username Lord Zenyar, and I'm going to be making a response to the review of No Country for Old Men by Confused Matthew. Okay, so I want to start this off with a preface here, about the film and about Confused Matthew in general. I want to say that I do not intend this to be a personal attack against Confused Matthew, so if that's the way that I come across, that is not my intention. I've watched many of Matthew's videos in the past, and for the most part I've really enjoyed the reviews, with some exceptions. 2001, The Incredibles, The Lion King, Minority Report, and this movie, No Country for Old Men. I'm not going to say that I absolutely love all of these movies, because I don't, but I think that in each of these reviews I can see the same overall problem: personal bias interfering with objective reviewing techniques. All of these films end up getting less credit than they deserve and are tossed aside without really looking at the big picture. I'm not going to go into detail on each of these films, but I want to briefly say a few things about them. 2001 had many issues with its shallow plot, but that's also completely missing the point that the filmmakers wanted to convey. It was more about the visuals and the sound, trying to get into the mind of the viewer and make them see things from a new perspective. If you went into that film wanting a lot of action or traditional narrative, you were going to be disappointed. I think that one of the film's flaws is failing to wrap the plot into the larger context of the story. In The Incredibles review, you complained that the plot was too depressing and it ruined an otherwise good movie. I don't know about anyone else, but I to this day have never found another person who thought The Incredibles was too dark to be enjoyable. It was humorous and entertaining comedy. Even if you did find it too dark, you need to weigh that criticism versus all the other parts of the movie, the comedy value, the characters, the plot, etc. You cannot focus on one point like that. The Lion King review I really don't understand. Unlike The Incredibles, this really is a kid's movie. The characterization in the plot has to be simplified for children to understand. Even so, it still has a lot of depth to it, and a simple story of a kid who has to choose between an apathetic life and taking on his responsibilities. You can obviously argue that the transition of his change is too fast and maybe unrealistic. But again, this is a kid's movie. It's not very long and doesn't need to start getting into the gray morality issues. The Minority Report review also annoyed me. I don't personally love this movie either, but the criticisms you make seem minor in the objective framework of the movie. Much like another similar movie, Equilibrium, the premise is absolutely ridiculous and there are some plot holes in its logic. However, if you want to review a movie objectively, you have to set aside that point and take it for granted for a while. Even if this is the main criticism of the film, you cannot focus on it so much that you ignore every other aspect of the movie. I've seen dozens of other action movies that aren't half as deep, intriguing, or as well written as Minority Report. At least it tries to create a message about society and government. Even if you think it fails to deliver, the fact that they tried to do it and also made an entertaining action movie in the process means that they couldn't be all the way at the bottom on the scale of good and bad movies. To say that Minority Report and now No Country for Old Men are the worst movies ever made is ridiculous. You obviously haven't seen a lot of movies if you think that they place that low on the list. When you make a review, you have to take into account more than just the overall feel of the story. There are many more elements to it: sound, picture, cinematography, lighting, etc. While the story shouldn't be thrown aside for these elements, you have to see them as part of a cohesive mesh that all come together for a specific purpose of conveying the filmmaker's vision to the audience. I think you also need to take into account the intended audience of the movie, as you rightly pointed out in your own reviews, before making judgment on them. Now I've got to talk a little about No Country before I jump into this. This movie is an art film. That is, it's trying to tell a story while also trying to convey a certain mood, idea, or feeling to the audience. Whether it succeeds is up to you. I think it does, but again, that's subjective. The movie was intended to be an action thriller with deeper elements of the art film genre. Now immediately I have to say that this kind of movie is not going to be for everyone. I understand that perfectly. Art films always lose part of their audience because of their techniques and are often different from the norm. They are generally longer movies and do not focus on any presupposed movie structure. Another art film that I personally enjoyed but many others hated was The New World, which was the real story of Pocahontas. This film is cut in a way that makes it slower and that loses people right away. The story is also not told from a single person's perspective. It switches between different characters, most of which seem to be spaced out and oblivious to the plot because they're focused on their own simple lives. And this movie really struck me because it for once told a story where the main characters are not active plot devices. They are more interested in personal ambitions, love, or power, or happiness. They are just along for the ride as events spiral out of control around them. The reason I bring this up is because the movie creates an atmosphere filled with emotion. You can really get lost in it. That was the point of the movie, not to say, here's the characters, here's the bad guy, this is the conflict, this is the resolution. Now I enjoy movies which have this structure too, but every once in a while I like something that takes you out of the box and transports you to another world or into another mindset entirely. A few movies like Apocalypse Now, Pan's Labyrinth, There Will Be Blood, Battle Royale have done this for me. No Country for Old Men is also one of these movies. The point of the movie is not to say, this is the plot, this is the good guy, this is the bad guy, and this is how it's going to end. The point of the movie is really not even the plot of the movie at all, but the psychological journey that follows it. The point is really to make you think. Now before I talk more about that, I want to challenge the assumption that this movie is obscurantism, which deliberately tries to conceal its meaning. I think that the meaning is deeper and probably harder to find, but I don't think that this is obscurantism in the classic sense. The Coen brothers have a point to make in this film, they just don't sit the viewer down and say it. Is it too subtle to understand? For many people, yes. However, if you get to the end of the movie and don't have any theories at all, then you really didn't try. I had a number of ideas about what this movie was trying to convey by the end, and I think some of them are right and some of them are wrong. Again, the point was to make you think. That doesn't mean that the Coen brothers were just too lazy to come up with something. A lot of Confused Matthew's review seems to imply that the filmmakers simply threw the story and scenes together in an attempt to fake intellectualism. I think that this is a huge misconception. Every scene in this movie is deliberately created with a meaning and intention. That said, it's not going to shove itself in your face. Ironically, your reaction to this movie is similar to my reaction to another recent Coen brothers film, Burn After Reading. A good number of people thought it was decent, but I personally thought it was one of the worst movies they made. It really was just a random movie, and it wasn't all that funny. Summing up my point, in the end, a lead character even says, "What did we learn?" And the other guy replies, "I don't know." Now, I think that even as much as I didn't like the style of writing and the humor in this movie, I think that in the grand scheme of things, it wasn't terrible. The comedy was simply targeted at an older audience. And I mean literally older, like 40 and above. I personally don't think I could write an unbiased review of this movie, because it really isn't for my audience. If I was to review it, I would review it relative to other comedies and movies similar. I would not say it is the worst comedy ever, because obviously this can't be the truth. I laughed plenty of times, even though I was frustrated at many points during the movie. No Country is a profoundly different style of movie because it does have a linear plot and a point to it. It's easy to follow, and the concepts did make me think. I think you pretty much summed up what I consider to be an unfair bias in the first 2 minutes of your review.
Let me get every single response that I'm going to get for this review out of the way right now. Oh, you just don't get it. Chigurh is a metaphor for death. Llewellyn demonstrates that death is inescapable and how you can't run from it. And Tommy Lee Jones demonstrates that things aren't like they used to be and how the world has changed so much and he can't keep up with it. Bullshit! This movie is about nothing.
Now, I think if you've made up your mind to believe this and you've put it at the very beginning of your review, it shows a certain lack of professionalism. This is what I mean by a straw man argument, reducing those who think differently to whining morons who are obviously just die-hard fans of the Coens. And not only do you do this once, but you repeat this many, many times throughout your review. You've decided this film is about nothing, so you're going to select a few scenes in the movie without dialogue and, well, it's better if I show you.
So he kind of wanders around the house and Llewellyn's not there. So he kind of wanders around the house and Llewellyn's not there. So he kind of wanders around the house and Llewellyn's not there. Stop telling me to shut up. That's all that's happening in the film right now. Why weren't you telling the film to shut up?
See, I don't remember those voiceovers when I watched the movie. It seemed a little quieter. I can't remember. But I wasn't bouncing my seat like a hyperactive toddler, so impatient that I couldn't wait 30 seconds for the next scene to start. Oh look, I just used a straw man argument, my bad. In all fairness, these scenes are an exact demonstration of the art film elements in this movie, and this is why I can understand how some people would not like the film. Instead of showing a 5-second clip of Chigurh quickly looking around the abandoned home, the filmmakers used some interesting cinematography to show the eerie elements of the killer's personality. He isn't angry that he lost his prey, he is utterly emotionless. He doesn't get aggravated or impatient or try to get away quickly like any other criminal would. He gets out a bottle of milk and sits down slowly to think about his next move. He's an enemy which is deliberate, unconcerned with his own safety, and unstoppable. He can do whatever he wants, spend as much time as he needs, because he knows that in the end he's going to win. This of course ties into the larger theme of the movie, which is fate. Llewellyn purposely decided to get involved in something that was too big for him to handle. He thinks he's tough enough to get away with it. He might win a few rounds, but in the end he can't escape the inevitable consequences of his choices, just like all of us. Was he right or wrong to do what he did in the first place? The viewer can decide for themselves, but it's ultimately irrelevant. The point is about consequence. I know exactly what you're thinking now. This is ridiculous. You're overstretching the meaning of this movie. These scenes are just pointless pieces of shit. You're trying to go back and find meaning in them after the fact. You just won't admit that the Coen brothers didn't know what they meant, so you created your own ideas to fill in for their failure. Is that about right? Well, I could be wrong, but I think that's about the gist of the argument in your review. I say, fine. You choose to believe the filmmakers screwed up and everything they did was just a bunch of elaborate bullshit. Even if this is true, a large number of people, including myself, were able to draw out a deep meaning from the film. Maybe the Coen brothers never had a point to make, but so many people wouldn't have been able to find a meaning unless this movie was well made. If your opinion is that this movie has no philosophical point to make, then set that point aside. It's just one part of a larger critique. You can't base the entire argument around it. Next, I want to move on to the characters. You say there are no characters because there is no performance or emotion. First of all, I think you must have fallen asleep during the movie, which, as I said before, is acceptable. But even if you do, you're not giving enough credit to these actors. The movie is made in almost a documentary style. The characters are actually more believable to me because they're not over the top. They're just ordinary people. There is much more performance here than what you're letting on to. No one is shouting or bawling in tears, but there is emotion between characters. Llewellyn is out to make a better life for his wife and wants to prove that he can take anything that anyone throws his way, like a real American hero. His wife cares for him and wants to keep him safe. She never really cared about the money or the things that he wanted to get for her. The sheriff sympathizes with both of them and wants to help the couple. He's world-weary, though, so he's not a Clint Eastwood character. Carson Wells is also overconfident like Llewellyn, and of course he gets it in the end. I already talked a little about Chigurh. If you want to see him as simply the sum of his actions, he's a serial killer with no emotion. If you choose to look a little deeper, he's exactly what you've discredited in the first few minutes of your review, the angel of death, fate, or whatever you want to call him. His actions are not tied to any real motives except chance, not dissimilar from Harvey of the Batman series. Multiple times he tests people by giving them a 50-50 shot at survival. Even those who he doesn't flip a coin for are still just unlucky. They got in his way. Anton may have been hired to do the work of the businessman, but he's really just out to prove a point. If you try to fight the odds to get ahead, you better be prepared for the possibilities because you've got a 50-50 chance of success. This theme reminds me a lot of a brilliant Japanese film I mentioned earlier called Battle Royale, in which a class of students are forced to fight to the death for their survival. The ultimate point the filmmaker was trying to make, and the writer of the book it was based on, was that our modern society is based on competition and exploitation in a dog-eat-dog world. Everyone starts out with a random set of weapons, skills, and has to fight for survival. But ultimately, even the best armed or most skilled people do not necessarily survive. In this way, I think No Country is addressing a very similar idea. As Tommy Lee Jones says, the country and the world is becoming increasingly violent for the sake of money and power. This is evidenced by his story of the people who kill the old people to steal their Social Security money. This is also seen by the violent nature of the killers and the drug deal, Llewellyn's determination to get rich quick, and the smug determination of the businessman who hires Wells. The writers get double points in my book for actually pointing out in a scene between Jones and his uncle near the end of the movie that it's always been this violent and people have always been greedy. That's just the way people act. Nothing's really changed except his perception of the world. As the sheriff says in the first few minutes of the film, you have to say, okay, I'll be a part of this world, even though he sees so much darkness and evil around him. In the final scene of the movie, he explains how in his dream, his father was carrying the light into the darkness ahead of him, waiting for him. In a sense, his father was passing on the torch to him, so he could keep going ahead someday to continue his work. There will always be evil, so there must always be someone to stand up to it, even if they can never win. Thankfully, I'm glad that the majority of reviewers took the time to think about this movie. I was happy to see that it got such high reviews all around and received so many awards. Ultimately, I expect that there are always people on the high and low end of the spectrum when it comes to liking a movie, but I was frankly a little surprised by the tone of this review. I think that's where I'm going to leave off for now. I expect I'll have more to talk about later, but I'll do that separately if I get any other responses. Thanks for listening.